sake of peace and justice, let us move toward a world in which all people are at last free to determine their own destiny.
America's influence is considerable, and we will use it confidently in freedom's cause. The best hope for peace in our world is the expansion of freedom in all the world.
Equality for men and women, the freedom of religion, and the right to choose your own leaders. But after decades of accepting the world as it is, we have a chance to pursue the world as it should be.
It's already fair to say good afternoon, the last session before lunch, The Good Guys, The Special Burden of Democratic Nations, a star-studded cast, and I'm going to hand over straight away to our moderator, Kathleen Koch, to get proceedings underway.
Thank you, Robin. And thank you all for joining us today. The title of our panel, in and of itself, The Good Guys, question mark, I think really does reflect the internal debate and the self-doubt that many in our community of democracies have been going through today as we look at our recent interventions in countries like Iraq, like Afghanistan, and we ask ourselves, were we the good guys? Did we get it right? Did we do the right thing, or did we do more harm than good? So on our panel today, and in our questioning, though, I would like us not to look back, not to rehash the past, but let's, if we can, look forward and really reflect on the lessons learned in these interventions and see how they can inform the actions of our community of democracies as we move forward into the future. First, again, we have a panel of luminaries that virtually need no introduction, but I will briefly introduce them nonetheless. First, Juan Carlos Pinzon, Minister of National Defense for Colombia. Welcome. Senator John McCain of Arizona, co-chair of the forum's congressional delegation, and someone who I personally have had the honor to interview in Washington since he was a congressman back in the early 80s. So welcome, Senator. Our wonderful host, Canada's Minister of National Defense, Peter MacKay. Thank you for having us all here. And finally, Joseph Joffe, the publisher-editor of the German weekly Die Zeit. Thank you, gentlemen. And Senator, I would like to start with you. The first panel yesterday was looking at this question of the new normal and the United States' current light footprint strategy. I could literally feel you chomping at the bit as one of the panelists discussed what he saw as the U.S. role in the world being in such a state of flux now that we are less willing than ever before to step up to try to solve the chaos in the world, especially when there's no pressing national interest.
First of all, I think we have to, as politicians, understand what our constituents is, what our citizens, what their priorities are and what their concerns are. Our former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff made a comment that's been often quoted. He said, our greatest national security threat is our economy. And I think that that is absolutely true. When we have half the homes in my state of Arizona still underwater, worth less than the mortgages that they're paying, people, obviously, their attention is on that aspect of their lives. And so when we talk about foreign adventures, they're very reluctant, particularly with our Afghan and Iraq experiences, that they are extremely reluctant. It calls for leadership. It calls for leaders to inform people why it's important what's happening in the Arab world, why the rise of radical Islamic extremism over time poses a threat to us, why China, in their sometimes immature behavior, can pose a threat over time to stability in the Asia-Pacific region. So it's up to us to try to explain to our citizens and our constituents why it is that we have to do a lot of things. Foreign aid, that's the favorite target. I just want to mention one thing. There has always been an element, particularly in the Republican Party, there's always been a conflict. It's between the isolationists and those who believe that we have a role to play in the world. You can trace it back to after World War I, when we rejected United States membership in the League of Nations, the prior to World War II isolationists, Lindbergh, Ford, all those. The post-World War II, where it was the Taft wing and the Eisenhower wing. And we are seeing that coming back strongly in my party today.
How much does that concern you, sir?
Concerns me a great deal. We had a vote in the Senate by the senator from Kentucky just before we went out to cut off aid to Pakistan, Libya, and Egypt. It only got 10 votes, but now that's spread all around the far right. Oh, they should have voted to cut off that aid. And so we are seeing that emerge in our party and in our nation. And a lot of people say, why should we be spending money on these foreign adventures and foreign assistance when we have so much trouble at home? And that debate will rage now, between now and the next elections, and particularly the next presidential elections.
Minister McKay, your nation has really been such a loyal ally to the United States. Following us into Afghanistan, your country was involved to a lesser extent, certainly in Iraq. But considering the outcome in these two places, how would you say your nation's point of view has changed, if it has, on the responsibilities of we democracies to take actions like that?
Well, I'll come directly to that, but I want to play off something that Senator McCain said, that in considering interventions, military contributions, foreign aid, there's no question that the very stormy economic situation that we've all come through, the fragility of the economy still, directly influences a government's thought process. It certainly is a determining factor as to what and if a country will contribute to an intervention.
Look at the cutbacks the British are.
25%. I mean, they're tying up ships. There's soldiers in the field getting notices that there won't be a job for them when they return from service overseas. So my father had an expression I thought that was very apt. He said, when the water in the drinking hole starts to go down, the animals look at each other differently. And the water table... So
what does that mean as we go forward, then?
The water table is low. So
we do less?
Canada joined the United States and others, our allies, in the decision to go to Afghanistan. We had a Security Council resolution. There was a clear indication that had we not, Afghanistan would remain an incubator and an exporter of terrorism. So, you know, to answer directly, was it the right decision to go? Yes. Afghanistan certainly no longer poses that threat to the world, and Minister Wardak, who's joining us here, I know will have some very insightful comments. But the reality is, to bring it into the topic of this panel, there is a higher calling, in my view, and an obligation on democracies, on countries that see themselves as, yes, accountable to their populations.
No matter the cost?
But accountable to the broader world. And we can't sit in splendid isolation in North America or anywhere else and think that the world won't come to our door. It did on 9/11. So not at any cost, not without very informed decision-making, often instructed by the Security Council and other bodies, other consultations, NATO being very high on that list. And you know, what I suspect we'll get to in this panel is Syria. What's happening in Israel as we gather here this weekend. And so these are the questions of our time. These are the challenges of our generation. And that's, I think, one of the great benefits of opportunities like Halifax, to have a very in-depth discussion about how we act as a community of democracies, a community of countries that care, that are compassionate, and that are able to do something to stop the slaughter of innocent civilians.
Minister Pinson, there are many who say that we need to, as we have more young emerging democracies like your own, that they need to be stepping up to the plate and taking more of the responsibilities. We're talking, you know, Indonesia, India, Brazil, Turkey, South Africa. But at the same time, I also hear the statement made that, and as they get involved increasingly and should step up to the plate in helping to nurture democracy, protect human rights, that those countries also have to be careful to make sure their own house is in order in that respect, that those in glass houses can't throw stones. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think certainly more nations now have a role to play. And definitely, in our case, we're trying to play that role based on our experience. As you maybe might know, most of you, our country just 10, 20 years ago was mentioned always by terrible cases of violence, terrible cases of terrorism, drug trafficking. That was the main story in our case. I think one important message that I believe for this panel is that certainly democracy is very important. But it's very important when it's the people that really wants to save their own nation and want to play everything around. I think that's a little bit what happened in Colombia. In our case, certainly very strong, important leadership, vision from many of our leaders, but at the same time, a national will to recover the country, to find a road, I think it has been critical. And by having that, then you find international support and cooperation. And I think the case of Colombia becomes an interesting case of how international support, but following behind national leadership, can become a process that can provide some important results. At the end, what we are getting right now is stronger institutions, and those institutions are the ones that are allowing us to think about a better future, a better democracy. Currently, what is going on in our case is that still we have very big challenges, and we know that, but we need to keep doing what we're doing, keep moving forward, and more importantly, we have learned that with a very humble attitude, we can offer other nations what we learn, our experience. And this is what we're trying to do now, to be very humble, but at the same time to tell, this is what we did, this is what we learned. If you think is useful, come with us, we can give you these ideas.
Thank you. Mr. Jaffe, as we look at the current economic situation globally today in the United States, obviously in Europe and around the world, and we talk about trying to nurture and support democracies and protect human rights, as both the senator and the minister mentioned earlier, does the question morph into, not so much what we want to do and what our responsibilities are, but what we can do, what we can afford to do in these days and times?
Well, you're right that we shouldn't dwell too much on the past, but the past of humanitarian intervention or non-intervention teaches us something about the future. There are 5 cases. There's Rwanda, there's Darfur, there's Srebrenica, there's Libya, and there's now Syria. We only intervened in one of them, Libya, because when we bombed Serbia, that was 4 years after Srebrenica. And if you look at that lineup, some very nasty questions appear when we talk about humanitarian intervention. There are so many of them, 7, that I had to write them down. First, which moral duty demands how much sacrifice? Second, will I have to commit more bloodshed than the bloodshed I want to prevent? 3, do I have the capabilities? And that's what we're talking about here. What are my chances of success? 4. 5, how sustainable is my mission? How much stamina do I have? And that's very relevant if you look at Iraq and Afghanistan. 6, is there an end to this intervention? Do I have an exit strategy? And 7, and finally, what will happen after I leave? Will the killing resume? Must I come back? Now, if you look at it in this way, and you apply that roster to the 5 cases, you understand why we intervened in only one case. It was quick, didn't take any sacrifice on our part. We fought from the air. Thank God we got the ammunition from the United States. There was some strategic interest on the part of the Europeans. It was too close to home. And we didn't go on the ground and we didn't stay. So in other words, and that's where I end, there's some very harsh limiting conditions to humanitarian interventions, and the moral obligation is just one part of the calculus.
Minister McKay.
Well, I think it's a very interesting point about the obligation, the burden that we're talking about, and not all democracies are created equally. Not all democracies came about in the same way, the same form or fashion. So one of the subjects around the NATO tables annually is burden sharing. This leads into this question of what can you contribute? You can contribute something. And when the decision is made to make an intervention, which is a very, very difficult one, and you're absolutely right to suggest that there are long-term implications. You certainly don't want to leave things worse than you found them. And this is, of course, much of the consternation and the stress I suspect that people in Afghanistan are feeling post-2014. What is going to be left behind? Will the peace and stability hold? What about the ongoing development projects that are in that country? And that has been true going back to the Second World War and beyond. So put it into the context of Syria. Who can make the most meaningful contributions now? And the contribution doesn't have to be military. Russia, I would suggest, should be called upon to step up and belly up to the UN Security Council and exert influence. They, I suggest, are the most influential at this time and have the ability, number one, to stop supporting this regime that is slaughtering its citizens, to stop, by its acquiescence, standing on the sidelines and letting it happen while the rest of the world wrings its hands and sucks its teeth.
How do we accomplish that?
Well, because I think they can exert influence in the capital of Syria. I think they're one of the few countries that really can at this point. Iran, forget about it.
That's the why, but I asked how. How do we get them to take that action?
Because they could support Security Council resolutions, which thus far we have not been able to achieve because of the reticence of China and Russia.
We discuss responsibility to protect it. Go ahead,
Let me
Senator.
just say that what I think we are talking about here is where do we intervene and where we do not, and what is the rationale for doing so or not doing so. I think it's got to be based on one fundamental principle, and that is our interests are our values and our values are our interests. I say that because we went to Bosnia not because they were a threat to the United States of America, but because Muslims were being slaughtered. That probably did not affect the future of a lot of countries, but we went in because we could stop it. The same thing with Kosovo. We regretted that we did not deeply, President Clinton said his greatest regret of his entire administration was that we did not stop the slaughter of 800,000 people in Rwanda. But also that did beg the question of how could we have intervened effectively in Rwanda. So the strong caveat to that is that we can't right every wrong. We can't put out every fire. We can't intervene even though there's a compelling humanitarian interest. But where we can, we should, because it is in our interest to see countries develop, to have a chance for democracy and freedom, and the things that we have all stood for, certainly in our countries, for well over 200 years. So the decision has to be made by policymakers where our interests and our values, but also where it's possible, but also you have to have the support of the American people. Otherwise, like the Vietnam War, you leave in disarray because the American people lost confidence in their government and in the mission they were on. I still, as good a relations as we have with Vietnam now, we still condemned a few million people to refugee camps, to re-education camps and execution and all of those things. So I think that the discussion that has to be made between leaders and their constituents is that if we see something that we can rectify, we should. But we have to understand the limitations of those interventions, because you're far worse off if you fail if you had never gone there to start with. And this brings us to Syria. I'm ashamed. I'm ashamed. I'm ashamed as an American. I've been to the refugee camps and met the young women who've been gang raped. I've met the families who've watched their kids shot before their eyes. I've met the defectors who said their instructions are to go around and kill and rape and torture. And while we sit by and watch that happen without even giving them weapons to defend themselves, this will be a shameful chapter in American history, my friends, because we could have done something and we can do something today, but we won't. Now, I hear that the president, having been reelected, will be re-examining all this. Well, only 37,000 people have been massacred. I guess in the grand scheme of things, that's not too many compared to some wars. But we could have done something about it. And we can still do something about it. And we can do it collectively, and to allow, in all due respect, Peter, because Russia vetoes a resolution in the Security Council as a reason for not doing so, to me, is not sufficient reason to not to act.
Mr. Joffe, you wanted to jump in, excuse me.
Our values are our interests and vice versa. I'm not sure that's always the case. Our interest, the West's interest, was, in the case of Iraq, to maintain that bastion of power against an expansionist Iran. Then we intervened against the bad guy, which was required by our values, and what we ended up was liberating the power of Iran and making Iran that much stronger, which is giving us a hell of a lot of trouble down the line. Yeah, no, but let me finish.
Could I respond to that very quickly? The perception at the time, the greater threat was the weapons of mass destruction. That was a greater threat, perceived-wise, whether that was right or wrong, was it good, than we believed that the threat from Iran was.
Okay, no, I understand what we believe, but I'm saying that's one of the outcomes. Maybe we couldn't have predicted the outcome, but it's a sad outcome where our interests and our values were not the same. Now we get to Syria. The problem with these countries is that there is a civil war there. And in a civil war, you don't necessarily divide up bad guys from good guys. So we give weapons to one party, which then makes it and subjugates the other, and then proceeds to slaughter the losers, the Alawites, the Kurds, the Christians, the few Jews that are left. So that is what bothers me so much. In a way, we have to be there and stay there, and then protect our former enemies against our former friends who are now beginning to slaughter these guys. So that's why the point here is very simple. If you go in, you have to be ready to stay and protect those whom you help, when you help the others to vanquish those, we have to protect them. So it's a long-term obligation, I think. We can't just go in and leave.
I'd like to bring in Minister Pinzon.
Let me comment on this discussion. Certainly, I come from a place that we have a different optic and certainly different perspective.
Absolutely.
Listening to the discussion is kind of wonderful to see how, large nations can think about. But I would, comment the following. I think that certainly when you see human rights violations, when you see the cases Senator McCain have described, I understand the moral obligation to step in front and find a way to solve things. But I think we are in an era of not intervention, but cooperation. And I believe our case could be a one to look around. Because when you intervene, my impression is that sooner or later you will harm the people you're trying to support, just by the idea that someone from the outside is trying to solve problems or to take over your own responsibilities. But when you think that you can support a system that is really willing to make things happen, respecting culture, respecting realities, understanding what is behind, I think the potential of that cooperation, of that support, could bring something more lasting, if I can use the word. So I think it's not a matter of defending, protecting human rights, protecting people, protecting the right values of democracy and, I insist, respecting human life. But it's the way. And I think that kind of discussion should come to be discussed in the following years. Certainly, from my perspective, from what we have learned, you have learned in your presence in the Middle East, but certainly on other cases like ours, in which I have to tell very openly, if we can say that we have progress, we have not finished, but we have progress. Our leader, President Santos, is already having the vision of peace because what we have done, the strength we have gained, but that has come very well connected with the U.S. support. I have to be very frank, with that kind of cooperation, with that kind of help, and with other nations. The UK have supported us very much. Israel, we have asked for that support. And I've been recently asking nowadays even the Minister of Canada to support us on some of our structural reforms. In my case, right now, the military reform. So it's kind of, you know, getting that kind of support that is allowing us to get into different layers and different levels. Not all cases are equal. That's the other thing. You have to discuss depending on what you find. But I would promote more the idea of intervention. I think that it's better thinking on cooperation, even with difficult partners.
I'd really love to get to the audience now because we have a fabulous panel, and I know you all want your time. Scotty.
Thank you so much, Scotty Greenwood from the United States. I just have to quickly thank you, Minister McKay, for your extraordinary convening and hospitality again this year. It's a brilliant event. And I have to say thank you to Senator McCain for your service to our country and your unvarnished candor as usual. So now for my question. The good guys, this title, you really are the good guys. And the special burden, I wanted to ask about something else, which is for the first time since you've been convening this Halifax group, Minister, Canada is in the chair of the Arctic Council. And after Canada's chairmanship, it'll be the United States chairmanship. So the whole world, there are only 8 nations that make up the Arctic Council, but the whole world's really interested. China is certainly interested in the maritime commerce potential, in the resources. The potential for environmental catastrophe is pretty gigantic there as well. Rescue missions, etc. What is the special burden of Canada and the United States with respect to the Arctic Council, and should countries like China be allowed observer status? And just briefly, while I've got it, Kathleen, Senator McCain in the last panel, the Law of the Sea Treaty was mentioned. Do you think the next Congress will ratify it, and if not, why not? Thanks.
The special burden, the role, I think, of Arctic Council members, all of whom are democracies, one of the underpinnings of democracies is a rules-based system, is respect for the rule of law, now, in addition to accountability to the people who elect you. So Canada has, you know, tremendous attachment, affection, sovereignty over arguably the largest part of the Arctic. And so there are certainly special obligations that come with that, stewardship of the environment. We have enormous interest, of course, in our own resources, our people. In fact, 40% of Canada's landmass is above the 60th parallel. Yet we only have roughly 100,000 of our 34 million people living there. So it is an enormous challenge, obligation, even to continue to exert the sovereignty. You mentioned search and rescue. At this time of year, it's becoming dark 24 hours a day. You have temperatures that plummet below 50 degrees Celsius. And you have opening waters and changes that are going to create a lot of challenges because more people simply are going to go there, and more countries have exerted or expressed an interest You mentioned China. There are many others that want to be part of this Arctic Council. To your question about the obligation, I think it comes back to people playing by the rules and respecting the fact that there are places when disputes arise, as is the case with Canada, the United States, in fact, on the Barents Sea and some of the bordering areas of the Arctic. I think there's a recognition that countries that adhere to a rules-based approach, you can go and resolve these in a court, in an international court, at the UN. The problem is, and this I think comes back to this whole panel discussion, is that if countries are not democracies, they don't respect rules. Terrorists don't play by any rules. Putting IEDs in the ground to blow up school children or putting suicide bombs on mentally disabled people and sending them into a crowded marketplace. I mean, these are, unthinkable atrocities that terrorists commit because there is no grounding, there is no inhibitions, because not only are they not democracies, they don't adhere to any rules whatsoever. And that's why I think some countries, and in fact some jurists have commented, that democracies are sometimes hobbled or handcuffed in their ability to respond in conflict, as it should be. There should be rules. But we're living in a world now where those rules, for many, certainly non-state actors, absolutely don't exist. Thus the conundrum. How do you respond? And sometimes respond with restraint when your emotion is to do otherwise.
Senator McKay?
I think we can. John Kerry has been very active in this issue. I think it's going to require a presidential push to convince a few. And I think it's important that we move forward with that. Just one additional note I want to make. That as I mentioned, and we all know, the world is so rapidly changing that the unpredictability of the world is the one thing that I think we would all agree on. And look at the world, as I mentioned last night, the first time we convened here, and look at it today. So what's it going to be like 4 years from now? We don't know. We have no real idea, because anybody that predicted the world 4 years ago would be like it is today. I'd like to meet you. So it seems to me it's even more important to have a common principles of behavior, of international behavior. We got to stick to those principles, because if we can't predict, all of us, at least during the Cold War, lived in a very predictable world. We really did. We knew the divisions, and we knew what the capabilities were. We knew what. We don't know what's going to happen in the rest. I don't know what's going to happen in China. I don't believe that 1.3 billion people are going to be satisfied forever under the present regime in which they live. So it seems to me it's even more important that we have certain principles guiding us. And I want to emphasize again, it doesn't mean we go everywhere and fight every battle and pull out our pistol at every provocation, because it has to be tempered by reality, and it has to be tempered by the fact that we're democracies and we have to have our people behind us. I've forgotten who the great philosopher that said, "Show me where my people are going so I can get out in front and lead them." And so,
that was the mayor of Boston, Curry.
There you go. You know, I think it was Voltaire, and I'm not sure. I'm not sure, but it probably would, maybe both. Yeah. Thank you.
To the next question, and I neglected to follow my duties as a moderator. If you would please stand and give us your name and the organization you represent, and then ask your question. Thank you.
My name is Mark Cameron from Canada. I work for Research in Motion, but that's not my capacity here. My question is, when it comes to the subtitle of this is the special burden of democracies, but the discussion is around the special burden of NATO countries and those countries closely aligned with them, like Australia or Japan or Colombia in this circumstance. There are other great democracies that don't see themselves as part of that camp. I'm thinking India, South Africa, Brazil, countries like that. And while I wouldn't expect those countries to necessarily send troops to Libya or something like that, you would expect a greater concern for democracy and human rights, especially in their own regions. In places like Zimbabwe or Burma, we haven't seen those countries step up and take a leadership role, even diplomatically or in terms of sanctions or other activities. I think these countries see themselves not so much as leaders of the democratic world, which they are and could be, but more as leaders of developing or emerging economies, or as leaders of post-colonial countries, and that solidarity seems to trump the democratic values that we share. Is there a way that we can encourage those countries to play a greater role and to see themselves more as part of the democratic powers and sharing common democratic values and putting that as a higher priority in their own foreign policy?
Jump right in.
I mean, the short answer, Mark, would be yes. I think, you know, all of those countries that you've listed and more, certainly in terms of their economic capacity compared to some of the smaller democracies, particularly some in the Americas, some that have a long history of embracing democratic values, but wouldn't have the bankroll, if you will, to participate in international missions, either militarily or on the development side. But, you know, again, I keep using Afghanistan as a touchstone, but there are some 40 countries that have troops on the ground, boots on the ground, but there are 60 plus that are contributing on the development side. Japan, Sweden, some of those democracies that are really making a remarkable difference in the day-to-day lives of Afghans. So there are many ways in which democracies can help spread democracy, which I think is a worthwhile endeavor, that we would agree. And, you know, there's different ways in which you can engage non-militarily that arguably are going to have a much needed effect in parts of the world right now. In some of these troubled areas, though, it's clearly at a tipping point where development is not the issue.
But somebody's got to protect those nice Swedes and others who dig the wells and teach the kids against the bad guys, right? And if you look around, it's, you know, it's a very interesting question, why aren't other democracies into the same game? And apparently, it seems to be an Anglo-Saxon habit. You think it's an old tradition, because no wonder these are the oldest democracies, the US and Britain. And the Brits were already fighting hard among themselves in the 1820s. Should we go and help the Greeks in the uprising against the Turks?
Well, they sent the Scots to do it.
You know, that, by the way, is a very profound joke, because if you're an empire that wants to make sure the world lives by some rules or your rules, it's always good to have an imperial class like the Scots, who don't make it in London because they're being discriminated against, and therefore go off to build the empire. So an imperial class is very important. But if you, it just came to me when that question was raised, if you look at the rest of the democratic world, the Swedes, the Danes, the Germans had another path to live down, the Spaniards, you name them, they're not exactly gung-ho on putting their blood on the line when it comes to pursuing and guaranteeing our values. So the point, I guess, here is you always got to have somebody who runs the show. There has to be one very large power. Usually it has been an Anglo-American, Anglo-Saxon power. And we are now in a phase, and that's where I'm going to end, of American development where the power that has carried the burden for the last 60 years now, as we all know, wants to leave from behind, is retracting from Afghanistan, from Iraq, and now exerts its power from afar and from above. You know, it's drones rather than boots on the ground. And so I fear that if nobody takes on the responsibility of organizing and maintaining the posse, there ain't going to be nobody else. It's not going to be India, or is there?
Senator Mikulski, I believe, had. Well, we'll get you the mic, but go ahead, Minister Pinzon, if you have wanted to add something.
I was just going to comment that I think there are more common threats going on in the world that are allowing nations, particularly democracies, to find each other. I'm speaking about transnational crime in general terms. Transnational crime is really creating a problem for nation states in a sense that we have borders, we have constraints, And certainly we can just not go after all the problems we're finding, from drug trafficking to counterfeiting, explosives and weapons, movement, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that allows an opportunity for increasing cooperation. And by the way, those nations that get a little bit isolated with some lack of international support on this easily can find their system and democracy at risk. In our case, what we're trying is to understand that anything that happens to our neighbors, even if they are a little bit far, at the end can become a problem for us. So what I think we're trying to use as an approach is not tell them you should do this or you should do that, but going there and asking, what do you need? From what I know, let me tell you what I can do for you. And this is a way, I think, to contribute to this cooperative
a softer
concept.
form of intervention.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Senator Mikulski.
Barbara Mikulski from the United States. Minister Bueno, my question and comments go to you. Much of the talk here about what can we do to help these democracies has centered around the topic or concept of massive reaction where military is needed, and then massive expenditure of foreign aid. Senator McCain rightfully said that the people in the United States of America are war-weary. But this then goes to Colombia, the countries of Latin America. So my question is that if one thinks about other forms where democracy plays a role, education, the empowerment of women, the bringing in of science and technology. You're a World Bank guy. You went to Harvard and did a specialty in science and technology. So here we are with tremendous knowledge in these fields. When we talk about helping democracies, how do you see that from not only education in villages, but Fulbright scholarships? That's our equivalent, but there are others, whether it's the French, the Canadians, the Brits, so that there are other ways for education, I believe in the empowerment of women and raising that status and inclusion, institutional, the international or American Bar Society helping with institutional reform. What do you think about that? Or is it such that unless you have big muscular defense, big muscular foreign aid, oh gee, America's kind of going wimpy, and so is the West? I don't think America will ever be wimpy in anything, but I'm more of an additional school of thought. What do you think?
Well, thank you,
And what would help Colombia, and what would help Latin America?
Thank you. Well, certainly I can tell that the U.S. support, and to speak very frankly on what you have requested, the U.S. support on law enforcement in Colombia definitely has been helpful. And I think that's a step one. But as you said, you need several points to develop. So certainly increasing security capabilities, increasing the state capability to promote and protect human rights. In a case like ours, where we had so many problems for so many years, was critical, decisive, and we will continue and need to continue to strengthen those capabilities. But the more that I'm Minister of Defense, I can tell you, and I was discussing this the other day in our own cabinet meeting, the more I go to far and away places, I get into the jungle, or I go to the mountains where we are currently under offensive operations to precisely try to bring back these parts of the country into stability, into democracy, into a better future. More and more people in those town hall meetings has 10-15% of the time requesting for security-specific issues from my office, but 80% of the time, 85% of the time dedicated to ask me for the road, for a healthcare solution, for an education solution. I think people certainly is right. I think what we are trying, and our experience shows, is that no doubt you need to bring security in order to start to have the opportunity of promoting human rights, to promote the right values of democracy and state. But behind that, there are many things you have to do in order to bring equality, in order to promote opportunities for the people. And I think that is an effort in our case that we'll have to do maybe for the next 20 to 30 years. It's not a matter of just defeating some drug traffickers or the guerrilla in one place, but it's what else we're going to bring to those places in order not to allow that to fall in other criminal hands.
Could I just say very quickly, I believe one of the most important aspects of our success in the world is these students who come to the United States and our scholarship programs. I also think our military-to-military relations
I got one
have
of
been...
those, Senator.
Exactly. Our military-to-military programs where military from people from countries all over the world come to the United States to our various different schools and colleges, and it has paid incredible dividends. These exchange programs and scholarship, there were 25,000 Chinese students graduated from an American university last year. I believe they go home and they have a tremendous impact, and all of it beneficial.
I would totally agree, and I think Senator Mikulski's point is spot on. You know, in order for the development and the aid to take root, there has to be the ground prepared. So security is the essential ingredient. It all happens under the umbrella of security first. I think my colleague from Colombia would agree. It's like sowing seeds on a paved parking lot. You know, they're going to blow away. They're not going to take root unless you have the secure ground prepared. But education is absolutely key to all of that, and enabling women. We're seeing more women, for example, now sitting in the Parliament of Afghanistan than in many of our democratic countries. We saw firsthand the impact that girls going to school in that to me will be the absolutely critical piece for that country. If it's to continue to evolve in a positive direction, is that women become decision makers. And the enthusiasm with which an entire generation of young Afghan women have embraced education it's awe-inspiring as to how transformative that'll be. But it has to be protected, because to your point, people will get off the back of the helicopter or the plane, and they'll be slaughtered unless there's soldiers there to protect them, to do their good work.
Next question.
Liam Fox, I'm one of the warlike Scots in the British House of Commons.
Indeed you are.
Going back to the title of this session, Good Guys. In the Cold War, we didn't believe we were different from the Soviets. We believed we were better. We believed that what we stood for and our values were better than theirs. Are we in danger now of slipping into almost a doctrine of the moral equivalence of states, not wanting to talk about our values in case we undermine cooperation? In particular, I think about human rights in China, women's rights in Islamic states. In the future, do we want to still be better or just different?
If I could attack that first very briefly, I think history shows us that alliances with people who are unsavory, who have oppressed their people, who have engaged in bad and corrupt governments, usually turns out not very well, even if it seems to be most convenient at the time. There was an editorial in the Washington Post this morning that I agree with, and that is, which is very unusual. It shows that even a blind hog unearths an acorn. But anyway, I'm not so sure that the President of the United States should dignify Hun Sen in Cambodia. He's corrupt, he's oppressive, and I also do not believe that perhaps it may be time for the President to go to Burma. Burma's got a long way to go. Our gauge for that is Aung San Suu Kyi. She didn't think this was the right time to do it. When you bestow a presidential visit on a country, it does a lot for that country. So I think that we have to be very careful who we align ourselves with, even if it seems to be most expedient at the moment.
I think you have to, Liam, absolutely action your values. I mean, it's easy to say, of course, and what does that really mean? But offering encouragement to fledgling democracies, Aung San Suu Kyi is an honorary Canadian, by the way, and embracing every single step that, that countries that are trying to embrace the values that we hold dear. And that means, you know, when you think about what is happening to Israel, 5,000 rockets fired into their country since 9/11. What country on the planet could tolerate that? And going back to the Senator's opening comments about accountability to the people that elect you, the #1 job of any government elected anywhere in the world is to protect the safety and security of its population. And that's why we have militaries, very capable ones. Senator? You know, I remember, I'm sorry, I remember very recently meeting with some veterans during Remembrance Week here, some who had landed at Dieppe, which didn't go well, and some who had landed at Normandy, which went better, in Sicily. And one of them made a comment about the fact that, you know, there seemed to be a lot of storm clouds gathering again, and war in places seemed imminent. And he said, I thought we said never again. Well, that was 70 years ago. It's still never again. And there are a lot of places that do need protection in the world today. John, you were one that did protect people by your actions. So as Scotty has said, we're very grateful for what you have done as a leader.
Thank you. Mr. Jaffe.
Senator, I want to make it a bit harder. Because we're all reading the papers today, these days, and what we suddenly have become aware of is a fundamental transformation of the strategic map of the Middle East. All the bad guys who were our guys are gone, like Mubarak. Probably Assad is also a goner. Such a nice place like Tunisia has gone Islamic. Qatar, one of the greatest dependents of the United States, is turning toward the extremists. Hamas attack on Israel is not out of the blue. It comes out of that strategic map. And so here we are being reminded once more, be careful what you wish for. We wanted democracy. We seem to be getting Islamization, and thus a Middle East-wide movement that is not, say, friendly toward the West, let alone to Israel. So what do we do until the good guys really become good guys, until Islamists become good liberal Democrats? And didn't we, and this is a very harsh question I'm asking, didn't we do better with the Mubaraks for about 30, 40 years?
Well, let me just respond very quickly. There were some of us back 2000, 2001, 2002 that tried to insert in our foreign aid to Egypt money for economic development, for human rights, for other reforms that we felt were very necessary because obviously the nature of the Mubarak government. And I'm not saying that we should shun every government because they aren't democratic. But what we should do is through as much persuasive powers that we have, including foreign aid, is to move them in the direction that we seek them to go. But I'd also add that there was nothing in the world that any of us were going to do to prevent the overthrow of Mubarak. He was going to go. And to cling to him after it was very aware that the people of Egypt were speaking in a very loud voice, then we were not, I think, correct in continuing to cling to him. And I do believe that Mubarak paid a very heavy price for the lack of the progress that a lot of us saw needed to change in Egypt. Now, we didn't predict this cataclysmic event, but we certainly predicted that things would get a lot worse in Egypt unless he changed and showed progress. I'd like to see Hun Sen in Cambodia show some progress. In fact, it's been in the opposite direction. So, look, I'm not saying this is easy. I'm saying it's very hard. We have people who spend their whole lives trying to solve these things, but I still believe that they've got to be based on some principles from which to act, and I certainly don't think that we're always right.
Next question, let's see, where's he? Right here, thank you.
Ishan, the Time magazine. I fear just this recent conversation made my question somewhat redundant, but if our values are our interests, and if our interests are our values, I was hoping Senator McCain could perhaps articulate more clearly what are the values undergirding the U.S.'s continued support for a rather repressive regime in Bahrain. What are the values undergirding a long-standing alliance with one of the most draconian repressive states in the world, in Saudi Arabia? And it's very easy to point to inconsistencies in American foreign policy, but I guess my larger question is, do the good guys deserve to be pragmatic realists?
Well, first of all, I guess maybe I didn't make myself very clear, but first of all, in the case of Bahrain, I've met with the Crown Prince, I've met with many others, and we have urged them in no uncertain terms that they must make progress there. And unfortunately, this is maybe turning into a Shia-Sunni conflict as much as anything else. I guess I didn't make myself clear. We try to bring about change where it's possible to bring about change, and we act in according fashion. That doesn't mean that, in my view, that we draw a line between every country, but we do. Our State Department every year issues a report about countries that are democratic, non-semi-democratic, and a lot of our actions in the Congress are dictated by that assessment and our own. So, look, I guess I'm trying to say and it's easy, I guess, to say, well, it's right or wrong, but I still don't see anything wrong with the principle of our interest, our values, but accommodate to the practicalities and the realities that you're dealing with. When a lot of us said that we got to make progress in Egypt, didn't advocate the overthrow of Mubarak, but we certainly did advocate the reduction in aid and earmarking aid for other reasons rather than military at the time. So you have to handle each one of these situations with a certain amount of pragmatism and a certain amount of recognition that you cannot right every wrong. But what you can do is advocate, and I believe one of the things I'm most proud of about the United States, with all our failings and all our flaws and all of the mistakes we've made, we are still the model that most people in the world would like to emulate. And I'm very proud of that.
Thank you. We have a question up here.
Thank you. Tomasz Palaszek. I used to be with the Center for European Reform in London, and now with the new Central European Policy Institute in Bratislava, Slovakia. If we had this debate 5 or 6 years ago, it would have been very different. We would have been talking a lot more about enlarging the zone of prosperity and stability in Europe itself by enlarging our institutions, the EU or NATO. What has happened to that agenda? Is it no longer a part of the democratic country's burden? And if the answer is it still is, we still care about whether Ukraine or Russia become more democratic or whether Georgia can become more stable, how do we get smarter about it? It isn't obvious that our institutions hold the same appeal that they used to hold, say, 5 or 6 years ago. It isn't obvious that countries like Ukraine have the same modernizing, democratizing instinct or zeal that countries of Central Europe had 10 years ago. So what, if anything, do we do differently to make sure that that part of Europe does become democratic and stable?
I might just say quickly, I think some countries have taken a bit of an appetite suppressant when it came to their ambitions of being part of the European Union, for example. And Liam Fox might like to comment on that further. But they are democratic. But they are democratic. But there also has to be a benefit that flows. I think that is very much part of the calculus as to whether people are going to pursue being part of a larger union, being part of an organization like NATO. There has to be some apparent benefit in so doing. You know, the ability for some countries to pursue these options and pursue foreign aid and pursue military interventions can be dictated by minority governments, coalition governments, caveats that are in place because of constitution. So it's a very complex decision-making process for governments and leaders to go through. It's three-dimensional chess in trying to decide what is best for the country, best for the people you represent. The good guys and the bad guys sometimes change teams, which changes their entire outlook. I still think coming back to the pursuit of democracy as an implicit good is founded upon accountability and people's ability to change their government. Change their government when it makes atrocious decisions or exhibits aggression against its people. And I guess that is the essential ingredient of democracy, I think, that we admire most, along with all the other goods that can flow. There are lots of flawed democracies that you can point to. But I think people seeing the control that they can have over their own government is why pursuing democracy is a worthwhile pursuit.
Could I just say the road is very rocky. The best example, of course, is Eastern Europe after the Iron Curtain fell. 2 steps forward, 1 step back. 2 steps forward, 1 step back. It's very difficult. It's very, very difficult, and we should never underestimate. If it was hard for the East European countries, you can imagine how difficult it is for some of the other parts of the world.
Okay, and we have a question up here.
John Vidicor for Senator McCain. Would you be so kind, Senator, to rate or evaluate American credibility, military and diplomatic, in relation or as it is seen by Russia, Iran, and China? In terms of Russia and China, I'm thinking of their conduct in the United Nations Security Council. Minister McKay was referring to that, and to the statement by Hillary Clinton that their behavior was despicable, yet nothing has occurred to block Russia. Arms shipments, Russian support to a reprehensible person like Assad, etc. Particularly in terms of Iran, because American inaction on Syria has obvious impact. But what America has said in terms of an engagement, red lines, is that there are red lines in relation to suspicious sites that might contain chemical weapons in Iran, but there are no, in Syria, but there are no red lines or no official red lines in relation to Iran and its pursuit of a nuclear weapon. And third, Russia in general, in its increasingly brazen, increasingly aggressively anti-American line, in light of President Obama's speech in the State Duma. And this brings in the whole issue of where democracy draw the line. But Mr. Obama, if you recall the speech, I'm talking about moral equivalency here, said that the Cold War was stupid and useless and had no positive outcome. America and Russia were equivalents, when after all, this was America's and its allies' greatest triumph since World War II. Please rate America's credibility, military and diplomatic, in relation to those 3 countries, Senator.
That was not a leading question.
Not at all.
I don't like to be overly critical of my own government. I congratulate President Obama on his re-election. The American people have spoken, and it's up to us and the loyal opposition to support the president wherever we possibly can, especially on national security, foreign policy issue. Very briefly, with Russia, clearly the reset button has failed. The NGO is being thrown out. The new definition of treason law that was just passed a couple of days ago in Russia. I mean, the list is so long. And by the way, we're about to pass the Magnitsky bill through the United States Senate. It just went through the House. It'll be very interesting to see Mr. Putin's reaction to that. I believe that Vladimir Putin believes in the near abroad. We see him meddling in the Ukraine, in the Baltics. We could go on for a long time. But my judgment of our relations with Russia is that we're going to have a evaluation of that, because I do not believe the reset has, doing away with the non-Lugar bill, which is clearly which has got to do with disposal of nuclear weapons, is clearly in Russia's interest. Why in the world would they want to negate that? But as far as Iran is concerned, I think they're hurting very badly. I think their economy is in the tank. I think they've got enormous difficulties, but yet we have not seen any deviation. In fact, there's a new IAEA report showing that they have increased their centrifuge capacity. I believe one of the reasons for that is because the open split between the United States and Israel. I'm not an expert on Israeli politics, but everybody tells me that the prime minister will probably be reelected. The president has just been reelected. It's time that we joined with Israel as far as Iran is concerned and draw red lines and make sure that they understand the solidarity there. In Syria, the President of the United States said that if Bashar Assad moved the chemical weapons around, that would be, he would have to take action. That would be a red line. So Bashar Assad interprets that as you can do anything you want to short of that. That's not a good signal to send to Bashar Assad. I am also hearing from, the New York Times, David Sanger here knows more about what the administration does, certainly, than I do. And he mentioned to me that after all, that's the voice. Anyway, that the administration is now reviewing the entire Syria issue. I hope that they will bring all of us into those discussions so that we can come up with a policy that all of us can support. I happen to think that the administration is coming around to the conclusion that the status quo, as was so well described by a earlier panel, is not something that we can sit by and watch forever. This is a new administration. The president, I know, like all presidents in their second terms, will be focusing a lot of his attention on national security issues. We want to work with him. We want to support him. We think these issues are too critical. But it's also our job as the loyal opposition to disagree where we disagree, and in an open and honest fashion, and engage in a debate that all the American people can take part in. And I'm sorry for the long answer. It was a tough.
Thank you, Senator.
Thank you.
Well, and I apologize, but we are out of time. I know so many of you wanted to ask questions. I think we could have gone on for another entire hour very easily with our wonderful panel, fascinating discussion. And as we leave, I'd just like to share with you the thoughts of two great men, Zbigniew Brzezinski, who once said, "The strength of a great power is diminished if it ceases to serve an idea." And former Secretary of State Colin Powell, in referring to Iraq and what happened there, "You break it, you own it." So let's keep that in mind as we move forward. Thank you so much. Thank you to my marvelous panel.
Ladies and gentlemen, just before you go, one important announcement, one important duty. At 2:30, the Halifax chat will be on Gaza and Israel with Mohammed Shtaya of the Palestinian Authority and Shlomo Bron, a retired IDF general and senior fellow at the National Security Studies in Israel. That's the announcement, and also my duty and my pleasure is to thank Kathleen Koch for a wonderful moderation of this session. Thank you. Great. So we'll see each other in the green room like 15 minutes.